And welcome back. Now, at this point, we have the basic functionality of our game, but as we know, when we pick up a package here, we get a message here in the console that tells us these things, that, hey, we've got that package. But what about to the player? How's the player going to know that we've picked up that package? And one of the ways we can do that is with a visual cue. So for example, let's say if our car drives along, picks up this package, it then changes to a different color. Well, there are several different ways we can handle that. We, of course, could come in here and change the sprite, and so I do have different color cars I can change it to, but let's just say you didn't have these different color cars that you could change to. How could you then do some kind of visual indicator without having to change the sprite? Well, we also can kind of cheat a little bit here, and you can see we have this color option. And if I look at color option and just look at my car real quick here, and I just kind of play around with this, as I start moving this around the color wheel, you can see how we can start manipulating the different hue and saturation values of this car to get kind of different things to show up. Now, we got to be careful how we move this, because sometimes that, of course, can affect different things. But, if I move around the color wheel itself, we, of course, do have different things that we can kind of play with here that we then can affect this car with. So it'll be something a little tricky that we may have to work with, but it is something that we can also use to kind of just give a little indicator. So if we, for example, say this is our default car color, and we say, hey, when we pick this up, we want this to maybe be just slightly darker or something to show that it has some of those car values here. Or maybe I'm going to spin this a little bit more green to show that, hey, there's a package on here. These are ways that we can do that to go ahead and add those different values in there, so that way we know that these are indeed what we want. Now, before we jump into actually doing any kind of coding, one thing I want to point out here in the color is there's these RGBA values here. And if you're not familiar with working with the color wheel, this is how these colors are kind of controlled. So for example, 255 you see is of course the max. If we switch this to 0 to 1, this is a little bit more computer friendly. So a lot of times it'll work in more of a 0 to 1 scale. It's the same thing. It's just this again is going to be a scale that the computer can be a little bit more familiar with. And in here, you'll notice if we have 1111, it's all set to this white tone. The white tone simply means we're not applying any tint, any hue or saturation changes to this car here. So it's just going to be whatever the default colors are that that sprite comes with. Now, if I go ahead and start moving this, so for example, if I take this slider and I start moving it over, you'll see how these values start to change. Now, of course, the one hasn't changed because that's the alpha. Alpha just stands for the transparency, so that's not going to be something we're as concerned with. But if I keep sliding this slider around, or even if I move it along here into these other color spectrums, you can see how that is really starting to come into play. All right, but that's enough playing around with that. Let's just go ahead and see how this now is going to work from a coding perspective. All right, so what we're going to want to do is go ahead and come on in here and create another serialized field. We want to make sure we do this though, so that way it is kind of its own thing here, right? So it's not going to build off a previous one, but we're going to go ahead and serialize the field here. And this time we're going to make this of type color because it's a color, but we're going to choose actually color 32. You can see we have a couple options here. The one we're going to work with 32, and because it's just going to be a 32-bit color, it's going to be a little bit easier to kind of play around with this. And what we want to do is set that equal to something, just like how we did it here. We have to set equal to something, but we need to give it a name first. Because remember, variables kind of follow the same pattern. Type, in this case, color 32, name, and then equals a value. So let's just say this is the has package color, and so that will tell me, hey, if I have a package, this is the color I'm setting it to. And by default, we're going to go ahead and say that this is a new color. If I just say the values, it's not going to be like that. New color, okay, we're going to do new color 32 or new color. Which one are we going to use here? Well, generally speaking, when I do this, I want to make it the same as what I see over here. So if this is a color 32 here, then this needs to be a new color 32 here. All right, and then we just, of course, going to put some parentheses in. You can see it's trying to help me fill this in a little bit, but all I'm going to do is go ahead and put 1, 1, 1, 1. All right, because again, that is that default value. Remember when we looked at that, we saw our RGB and alpha were all set to 1, and so this is how we want to make this so that way this is our default. Now, of course, we want to make it so what is that change color? What is that going to be? How can we control that one? Go ahead, pause the video, see if you can figure out what is that change that you want to make that, so that way you can go ahead and set a different tone. Okay, so let's go ahead and make that happen. I'm just going to go ahead and make my life a little easier. I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy this line here. I'm just going to go ahead and paste that in. And of course, you notice it does give me this error here because it says, hey, package color exists. Well, let's just change this to that we have a no package color. All right, so no package color, and we can leave this actually as 1111 because we're actually not going to change that here. Remember, we're going to actually go over into Unity to go ahead and change it. So let's see how that looks. So in Unity, you'll see in my delivery script, I now have, of course, 2 new serialized fields. And you can see I have package color, no package color. All right, and of course, these are right now kind of initialized to nothing. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure these are, for example, I want maybe this to be more of a green tone. So I'm just going to move that up near the greens. And then I might say, you know what, I want this other one, the no package color, just to be that white tinge because I want to just kind of be that default no tint color. And again, that's just going to initialize it based upon here, which gives us more control to see what this is going to look like. Rather than having to go into the code every time and try to change it to get that perfect value, we can actually control it right through here. But of course, even though it's now a serialized field, we haven't actually done anything to actually make this change when we pick up that package. So we actually need to go back into our code and add that component into the coding. So over here in our code, we can go ahead and add in that piece of code we know. Now, if you remember, all these things that we've kind of been working with color and stuff like that, when we looked at that in the default value, that was part of the sprite renderer component. So I'm actually going to go in here and right underneath my bool, let's go ahead and just hit enter here. And we're going to add in a sprite renderer. And you can see we will pop up sprite renderer, and it suggests we can use sprite renderer, and that's perfectly fine if you want to make it something more specific, like, hey, I want to keep track of what this is, or you start getting confused since this is sprite renderer, this sprite renderer, which one I'd use. Now this, again, it's perfectly fine, but sometimes it can be a little confusing, so I'm just going to go ahead and change this to car sprite renderer, just so that way I can keep track of what this is, because again, otherwise, if I start doing my code, I'm like, oh, I have 2 sprite renderers, which one am I using? It keeps it straight, so I don't have to keep track of, is it the lowercase s? Is it the uppercase s? So I'm just going to do this one just because, again, it's going to make it just a little bit nicer for me to keep track of that. Now, because we've added this in here, we want to add actually back in a code that we had previously removed, which was the start method. And so if we come in here and add in that start method, all right, you can see we'll pop in here, which is fine. And of course, it's giving some things here. It's like saying, hey, you can initialize package false, which you can put that in there if you want, because that's how we are treating this. It doesn't have to be in there, but we do need to, of course, go ahead and say, like, what is this going to be? What is our car sprite renderer going to be? All right, so if I put car sprite renderer in here, and I say, what does that need to equal? Now, you notice my Visual Studio is being very nice and giving you a very good help here of what this is probably. And this is actually very valid here. So car sprite renderer, we actually want to get a component, all right? Because if we look at our delivery car, if we look at that car, remember this is the sprite renderer component that was in that properties panel in Unity. And that component that we are looking at that's going to change the color is, of course, the sprite renderer property. And then, of course, if you can't have these here, remember these little brackets right here are on your keyboard. They're just little angle brackets. And then, of course, we need to make sure we have these open and closed parentheses because this is actually like a method invocation that's being done by Unity. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this. So again, just to recap, if we look here in our inspector, we, of course, are using a player card. This is our game component. The component we're looking at is the sprite renderer. And we, of course, are going to be manipulating this color field. So what we want to do then with that information in mind is, remember we have our on trigger here, and we of course are saying, hey, pick this package up. And of course we're setting these bools. We need to make sure we at this time change that color. Now we don't probably want to do it after we destroy because it's not going to do us much good. Okay, the object's been destroyed, great. We probably want that to happen before we do that. And we can either do it before or after the bool. I'm going to do it after the bool because again, that's perfectly fine. We can just throw that right there on the end. And all we want to do is take our car sprite renderer. All right, and we want to make it sure that this here, all right, because we have the sprite renderer, is going to be setting the color value. All right, and you can see the Visual Studio say, hey, you want to use .enable as false. Sometimes these suggestions aren't correct for what we want to do. So just be careful when you start seeing these suggestions come up that you don't automatically tab through because we don't want to use .enable. We actually instead want to use dot in here, color, all right, because we want to set the color. And now you can see it's suggesting has package color, which of course is what we want because has package color is what we've defined up here. And remember, because this is a serialized field, it's not going to necessarily set it to 11111. It's going to set it to whatever we have set within our serialized field. Now, of course, if we do this for when we pick up that package, we probably also want to do something similar, but for when that package has been delivered. Now, of course, that's not going to be has package color. Instead, we want to change that to the no package color. All right, because again, we want to make it so it's the opposite of that. All right, let's go ahead and test this out because it's always good to test any changes that we've done just to make sure things work. So here I am. I'm going to go ahead and drive up to my package. And my car has disappeared. Now, why is that? Why did my car disappear? Well, let's go ahead and look. The very first thing we always check is make sure our order is correct. Our order is high, so that looks good. So let's then go look at our package colors here and see. And if we look, our alpha value is all the way down near 0. Oh, that's not good, which means that car is almost completely transparent. So I actually need to take that alpha value and just going to crank that all the way up to 1 so I can make sure that car shows up. And then I'm going to check my other alpha value here and make sure that one is also all the way up. So it's something that we can easily miss, something we don't necessarily want to skip over. So again, always good to check that, make sure that those are good. And then let's go ahead and save and recheck our game just to make sure that that looks good. So then I'm going to go ahead, drive that up, boop, and of course it's changed the color. Now you can see this nice kind of dark green. And of course I can't pick up that package yet because I still have one. So if I deliver, boom, that looks good. Now, one thing you could do to make your game a little more consistent is since we have this color value here, I could of course go ahead and try to approximate or get the exact values for all my packages. So if you notice my packages right now with their color is kind of more of this red tone here. And so I could say, you know, I don't want this to be red. I want this to be kind of more of a green value. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but I might say, you know, I want this to be a little bit more of a green value. Just so that way, when I'm running that game, these can match just a little bit more here. So let's just go ahead and see now they're more of a green. So when I drive over, boop, you can see, of course, it's a little bit closer. I can, of course, make those a little bit closer, and I could, of course, then have those be different colors and tones. But it's just something that you can do to try and help make some consistency here within your various game elements. But that's a good start here. So, of course, now we have a visual indicator. So we have some kind of clue to the player that we can do things. But let's go ahead and keep moving forward on that game design progress here because we are, of course, getting really close to kind of having a game that's almost ready to go.